Hello. Right. This paper has had various titles along the way, and I thought I'd include all three in them. Now, the first one is straightforward, proving the paranormal by prioritizing the poltergeist. Now, the previous title, why there may be more of a gust of a chance of proving the paranormal, etc., etc., I will admit does sound as if it was written after having one of David Luke's psychedelics. But there is kind of a rhyme to this madness. Now, I kind of think that whilst that title might never be remembered, there's a Welsh train station with an unpronounceable name, and you never remember the name of the station, but you always remember that it's actually there. Because in some ways, this is more of a call to action to both the SPR and beyond, and I'm thinking the more it's remembered, the more I hope it provokes constructive criticism and thought. And then there's a final working title, for those who were not at the SPR conference in 2016, is a bit obscure. What more can the Romans do for us? But for those that were there, they might remember a paper presented in 2016 by Steve Parsons entitled What Have the Romans Done for Us?, in which Steve offered ideas of how we in the SPR could deal with spontaneous case research, which has led to a new set of guidelines, which I would thoroughly recommend buying, and various other ideas on which we can move forward. Now, to build on this, I wish to explain why we and others in the paranormal research community should put more emphasis and resources into a particular type of spontaneous case, that of poltergeist phenomena. But first, a quick bit of history. Up until the 1950s, the concept of spontaneous research was taken more seriously by the SPR and other organisations. In fact, up until 1949, we actually had a full-time investigations officer, a surprisingly familiar face, none other than Donald West, who was until recently still on the SPR Council. And Harry Price and Nandor Fodor were also actively engaged in full-time professional research for other organisations as well. Now, since that time, it's fair to say that most initiatives have been very sporadic and ad hoc. And it's perhaps saying something that the greatest success of the second half of the 20th century was instigated by a lone middle-aged male with no investigative experience at all and no training, who had just suffered a bereavement. Now, by most protocols, probably not the right thing to do, but thankfully the man in question was none other than the irrepressible and highly talented Maurice Grosse, who, with the later help of Guy Playfair, of course, as most of you know, turned the Enfield haunting into possibly one of the most meticulously researched poltergeist research cases to date. Now, what's also interesting about Enfield is it primarily involved the poltergeist. Because there's all a number of organisations using investigating apparitional phenomena to various degrees of competence and incompetence, measuring atmospheric changes, gathering testimony, a fleeting glimpse of this, that, or the other, which may well have psychological explanations and may well have explanations triggered off by changes in atmosphere themselves. So I'm thinking, by their very nature, can apparitional evidence really be proved, or will it always be ambiguous? But if you contrast that with the evidence for the poltergeist, which, if we capture it firsthand, is unambiguously either fact, paranormal fact, or fraud. Either the table moved or it was pushed. Either the brick flew through the air or it was thrown. If conscious or subconscious fraud can be disproved, a case of this kind is virtually paranormally proved. There's not even any climatic variations to worry about, as it seems from a couple of cases that poltergeist is virtually earthquake-proof. In a case, for example, of the Cairn City poltergeist in Bakersfield, California, there was actually an earthquake about 90 miles away, and the vibrations clearly felt. But none of that could actually replicate the poltergeist phenomena that had been occurring itself. Or even closer to home, in the case where Tony Cornell, and I love this story, approached his local borough surveyor and successfully asked if he could borrow some houses scheduled for demolition, to which he attached a robust vibrating device to replicate an earthquake. Even then, he couldn't get anything at all similar to poltergeist phenomena. When it comes to the poltergeist, atmospheric changes seem to be a non-starter. So, if it's so obvious, why are more poltergeist cases not investigated? Now, the SPR has had a very good new resource, the PSI Encyclopedia, to which I thought I would refer to reasons. And if we look at these reasons, I'll summarise them at first. The arguments against investigating poltergeists, essentially anecdotal, impeded by amateurs, too rare to investigate, and not enough funding. Now, let's look at these one by one. Now, being essentially anecdotal, claims of poltergeist evidence are vulnerable to exaggeration and bias. Now, I'd counteract that by referring you to a 2015 conference paper by Barrister Alan Murdy, who's speaking later, explaining that enough of these statements are gathered, they become what is known as similar fact evidence, powerful enough to convict in the court of law, so why not powerful enough to provide meaningful evidence? Now, such a level of witness statement was certainly achieved in Enfield, and as a witness testimony experiment I conducted a year or two back, I went to a famous site of potential poltergeist, the cage at St Joseph's in Essex, and interviewed 24 witnesses and came some way to replicating this, finding very good similarities in the phenomena reported by, importantly, unconnected witnesses. But I'd go further than this, and I'd say the premise that poltergeist phenomena is anecdotal is, to be honest, quite simply wrong. Poltergeist phenomena is actually highly recordable. Various ways of verifying it include possible poltergeist scratching, of which this is the archetypical case from the 1930s, Eleanor Zugan. However, when I was investigating the cage, I found that this poltergeist scratching incidents weren't actually as rare as we possibly envisaged, finding potentially 5 cases, including this one. Now, even more provable and disprovable is poltergeist wrapping. It's potentially verifiable based on the work of Barry Colvin, who found a particular sound envelope between normal raps and poltergeist raps, a particular difference. Poltergeist raps hitting peak amplitude in a far more gradual way to normal raps. Now, this is quite clearly a provable or disprovable hypothesis, which is crying out for more research. And the Spontaneous Case Committee did do a little more in about 18 months ago, when we were sent rapping sounds coming from a table which 2 people were sitting next to in Herefordshire Hall. There's a brief explanation of what the communicative raps actually said. Now, these raps were put under analysis by James Taxi, who's also here today, and they were found to basically replicate the same sort of sound envelope as Barry Colvin's. So already, the first reason for neglecting the poltergeist is cast aside. Now, the encyclopedia also states that serious investigations might find themselves impeded by local amateurs. And here I would say this can sometimes happen. But to be honest, it tends to happen simply because people are not aware that organisations such as the SPR are in a position to help. Give you an example. During the docudrama of the Enfield case a couple of years ago, attempts to contact the Spontaneous Case Committee and the SPR in general went up greatly. Now, this shows that people do want to deal with established societies, but only if and when the societies are shown to take an interest. We need to ask ourselves, do we show that interest often enough? But the third objection, possibly the most crucial, so the one I'll spend most time with, is if poltergeist activity is rare, can we really do any ongoing analysis? Question is poltergeist activity rare? Now, just as a sort of bit of ad hoc evidence, I spent a little time doing some research in my hometown of Thornton Heath, Croydon. Now, for any of those that know South London, it's a rather bland new town, not crying out to be haunted in any great way. But I quickly found that within 200 metres of my home, there was none other than the famous Thornton Heath poltergeist case, investigated in the 1930s by Harry Price and then very thoroughly by Nanda Fodor, who wrote a book about it 20 years later. There's an original press cutting from the Croydon Advertiser. Going just a mile away, we get to the 1980s case, made famous through a Colin Wilson book, Poltergeist, that of the King's Cellars pub. A poltergeist was a liking for knocking down beer glasses as well as many other things. Now, again, reports that the phenomenon had continued after the pub changed its name to Bar Latino in the early millennium. Sadly, however, it looks like this now and is ready to be knocked down for a new shopping centre. There was a further reported Thornton Heath poltergeist case in the 1970s, possibly thin in evidence, but amusing in some ways because there's actually been a low-budget film made about it. So Thornton Heath seems to be very much on the poltergeist map. And to finish, we have a case from the SPR journals itself. West Croydon poltergeist, again, less than a mile from my home. Typical poltergeist fare, a couple in bed hearing rapping and scratching noises from the bedside table that responds in an intelligent way. Now, to finish this little bit, I recently went up to Pontefract to investigate the background to what had become misleadingly known as the Black Monk of Pontefract case, which is a case involving a council house owned by a family then called the Pritchards. And I won't go into this particular case, but on following a lead to potential colleagues of the Pritchards, which were members of the Pontefract Sports and Social Club, we immediately walked into what appeared to be a well-witnessed poltergeist case in itself, possibly caused by a vagrant who the regulars had befriended prior to him dying. Now, this kind of shows that when you start looking for poltergeists, you do tend to come across case after case. However, if that's not enough, let's look at the theory of jots, those random object movements that have been thoroughly categorised by Mary Rose Barrington, especially walkabout jots, where objects disappear and reappear in another place. Now, these are especially common in poltergeist cases, but are even more common when no poltergeist case has been diagnosed. Now, this leaves a possibility that some one-off walkabout jots, especially like the trivial things Chris was talking about earlier, are simply one-off poltergeist incidents that would leave the phenomena extremely commonplace indeed. Now, of course, this is just a theory, but to prove or disprove this, there would need to be an ongoing, well-resourced research project. Now, another claimed weakness in poltergeist evidence is most of it just comes from North America and Western Europe. But what if it's a question of terminology? And what if other countries' terminology are simply so strange that we don't identify them as a poltergeist or even take them seriously? I mean, what sensible researcher would believe in a Colombian duende, or let's face it, it's a goblin really? Alan Murdy, again, hope I'm not taking where you talk out, has, however, uncovered factual incidents of duendes that throw pebbles and stones in people's houses, which have a very stark relation to those who are familiar with Guy Playfair's Brazilian poltergeist cases. The similarities are actually immense. It's also worth noting that Colombian Spanish has no word for poltergeist, so by definition, they can't describe them as such. And even Guy Playfair's cases are of interest in themselves, as outside of a lot of the major cities, some of the accounts are put down to black magic. Again, that's terminology that will put some serious academic researchers off. Now, it gets even stranger if we look to the east of Europe, because there's a mythological creature, most famous in Romania, but also found in other eastern countries, that is known to us as a vampire. Or more accurately, to those who happen to live in the Transylvanian mountains, a stigoi. Has a passing resemblance to a duende even. Now, surely this is not a topic for serious paranormal research. However, Richard Sugg, a lecturer in Renaissance literature in Durham University, has researched a large number of these so-called vampire cases. One case he refers to is that of a dead Greek man named Andalivrius, who in 1890 returned from the dead and smashed plates and glasses and clattered pots and pans in his home. Now, the people in his Greek village identified him as a vampire, but it was a vampire that behaved very much like a poltergeist. Now, Sugg believes this type of misidentification is common, quite possibly because vampiric incorruptible bodies are considered demonic by the Eastern Orthodox Church and therefore make a good representation of the paranormal, while the Catholic Church, in contrast, thinks of incorruptibles as being saints. And let's face it, saintly behaviour does not involve throwing Lego bricks or marbles and that sort of thing. Now, Jeff Holder, in his Poltergeist book, dedicates a whole chapter to this vampire connection. Just briefly, just one article from the London Observer, which we haven't got, but I'll read out. London Observer 1923 contains an account of a haunted house in Belgrade, Serbia, where windows were smashed by bricks and stones and furniture was moved violently to the point of destruction. Typical poltergeist fare, but then the inhabitants were of an opinion a vampire was at work. Now, I'm thinking perhaps this is all best summed up from a quote from the work of the Institute for Frontier Areas of Psychology, German institute set up in the 1950s by Hans Bender. Now, just to take a bit of this quote, depending on their cultural tradition or ideological background, exceptional experiences are described as supernatural, supersensory, or even magical. Where the culture has a magical background, the poltergeist will be referred to in all kinds of magical terms. So, I think this sums up that not only are poltergeists fairly common, but a worldwide phenomena, possibly hidden under a layer of cultural folklore. So, they are well worth investigating, so that brings us to the final issue, which is of course a very real one, taken from the PSI Encyclopedia. Whilst funding is available for certain types of paranormal investigating, noticeably PK and ESP experiments, such support is not readily available for field investigations. Now, I'd actually say this statement underestimates the problem. Not only have we neglected to investigate the poltergeist, but we have been slow in the UK when it even comes to investigating PK. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of that many recent attempts to replicate the PK initiatives that were carried out by the likes of Ryan and Schmidt in the USA, let alone the replication of William Voles, who both did PK in a lab and actually went over and investigated ongoing poltergeist cases. Now, such an experiment, for the parapsychologists in the audience, Chris, would help provide the missing link between field research and academic work for sure, and I think really is key. So, to sum up this call for action, if you like, despite the fact that poltergeist phenomena is potentially very common, potentially definitely provable and verifiable, there's been little serious research over the last 3 decades, perhaps not even a decent book written on the subject over the last 30 years, until quite recently. Now, how to address this goes beyond the scope of this paper. I do have some thoughts, but I don't want to go into them because I'd be interested in what your thoughts are. It's nice to see that there's 10 billion available in Sweden, however. But what I'd hope you'd agree is this subject is serious, neglected compared with ESP and so on, and desperately needs addressing. So, whichever title of this talk you'd prefer, I do hope, like the unpronounceable Welsh station, you'll at least remember you've heard it and feedback your own ideas. There's a blank space there and a contact email. And to take the very first title of the talk, What More Can the Romans Do For Us? I'd kind of finish off by saying there is a saying that Rome wasn't built in a day, but with regards to investigating and documenting the poltergeist, surely at least it's time to start building some foundations again. Thank you.